Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TBR's 2012 Addressable Market Forecast Review webinar. My name is Allison Crawford, and I'll be your host for today's session. TBR's focus is to provide business research to accelerate our customer success, and the information we'll be covering today comes directly from our 2012 Telecom Infrastructure Services Market Forecast Report. This detailed report provides a snapshot into the size of the TIS market, as well as information on vendor strategies, geographic growth, business segments, and more. The information our networking mobility team delivers is invaluable to any firm with plans to expand their footprint or compete more effectively in the global telecom infrastructure services market. We're excited to present some of our findings to you and get feedback on this information. Before I hand this over to Chris, there are a few action items I'd like to cover with you. First, we're recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the others that we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the materials we're presenting. Please send any questions or comments to the Q&A or chat function. Chris will address them at the end of the presentation. Or, if you'd like to set up a client inquiry for more detailed discussion, please reach out to Chris directly at the end of the webinar to set up that discussion. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find the slides as well as other thought leadership pieces, webinar decks, and commentaries on SlideShare at www.slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. Now let me introduce Chris Antlitz, analyst on the Networking Mobility team here at TBR. Chris has been covering the telecom infrastructure services market for the past 5 years and guides the research on our TIS benchmark. His insight into operators and their competitive strategies have helped our clients improve their strategic go-to-market plans and improve performance. And with that, let me hand this over to Chris.
Thanks, Allison, and welcome, everyone. Before we jump into the meat of the presentation, I just want to highlight what is TIS, what is this market we're looking at, and what are some of the ways that TBR looks at this market and getting this information. So TIS is all of the services provided on network infrastructure, so everything from the RAN, so the access network, the transport network, also the back office within operators, so OSS, BSS, SDP, other software functions like VoLTE, other applications that are being run over that network. So TIS encompasses all of those things. TIS, we have a model that does market sizing, margin analysis, and opportunity modeling across the 41 largest TIS suppliers around the world. We model out 4 main service areas, which is deployment, maintenance, professional, and managed services. And we do this across the 4 main regions. And what we're doing is identifying leaders, strategies, and growth opportunities, and benchmarking competitors off one another, looking at their portfolios, looking at traction they're getting in certain markets with certain types of customers. From a high level, the market that we're talking about here is a $95 billion annual opportunity. And we're going to be talking about what we see as the forecast over the next 5 years, how this market's going to develop. Next slide, please. So before we jump into that, the TIS coverage, so we cover the 41 largest TIS suppliers on a company-by-company basis. We cover the market across the entire spectrum. So we are covering the traditional network equipment suppliers all the way to more of the niche TIS suppliers like tower companies who are providing just the services on the actual towers that the cell sites are going onto. So companies like American Tower. We're also covering pure play OSS, BSS firms like an Amdocs, and then some of the more consulting and systems integration firms like an Atos, a CGI, or an Accenture, et cetera. So we are covering the broad market here, and we are looking at this from many different angles, from the niche markets all the way to the end-to-end solution providers. So AMF, this is what we're going to be discussing today, our findings for the 2012 AMF. The Addressable Market Forecast is our 5-year assessment of where the growth is going to be in the TIS market. We disaggregate this market by service type and by geography. And we also do some vendor market share analysis to see how the market's going to develop and how vendors are going to be positioned based on traction they've been getting in the marketplace. So with that, let's jump into to our assessment. This is 2012 roll-up, and then we will be discussing the 5 years from that. So for the next 5 years, we see this market growing at 2.2% CAGR. The underlying growth drivers here, there's 3 main things that we are looking at very closely, and these are the things that are really moving the needle. The big spend, where is that occurring? So the first thing is broadband deployments. This includes both fixed access and LTE. Now, LTE is the biggest driver from a spend standpoint, but fixed access deployments are also going to be a big contributor, especially as certain countries are engaging in national broadband initiatives to roll out access lines across their nationwide. The second big spend area is going to be outsourcing. So this is your traditional outtasking, so pieces of the network, and then it also includes full network outsourcing. So things like, for instance, Sprint, when they outsource their entire network to Ericsson. So both types of outsourcing are going to be very, very attractive for operators to continue to do because of the OpEx reduction that it brings them. And this is going to be a big area for vendors, certain vendors to capitalize on because they can benefit from economies of scale by taking on these contracts and spreading that cost over their resource base. The third thing that we are seeing develop, and we're at the very early stages of this right now, but business model transformation. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but essentially what it means is that operators are investing in new business models. So traditionally, they've gotten the bulk of their revenue from voice and now data services. They're going to start bringing out new offerings that leverage their data capabilities. So things like cloud services for enterprise and consumers. Mobile wallet is going to be more prevalent. So M2M is another big area that we're really going to see a strong ramp up in. So there's going to be spend on TIS for operators to enable these new business models, and they're going to be looking to the vendor community to help them implement these things on their behalf. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our chart for the 4 main service areas. So deployment, maintenance, professional managed services. In general, all 4 of these areas are going to be growing. However, deployment and maintenance services, so the traditional product attached services, they're going to peak in 2014 in line with LTE deployments. And then we're going to see a trail off in spend in those 2 areas. That will be partially offset by ongoing growth in professional and managed services. So if you look at this distribution of the data, you'll notice that 2014 we are estimating is going to be peak spend on TIS, and that is going to be primarily driven by the product attached services. So, and we'll talk about this in the next few slides, but if you look at the roadmaps for most operators in the world and how they are disaggregate what's the spend levels going to be as they deploy LTE and when they're going to deploy that LTE, we're seeing a convergence at late 2014. So that's our target for the peak spend on LTE globally. And again, we'll get into the specifics there on a regional basis because there's differences in each of the regions, how they're deploying and when. So LTE is the big driver there, and this spend distribution really correlates closely with that. But there are other things going on here that are driving growth. So outsourcing, again, is the popular OpEx reduction tool for operators. In emerging markets and in Europe especially, we're going to see more and more outsourcing taking place. In Europe, because operators are really struggling with ARPU declines, and they are struggling with very strict regulatory environment that has been not very good to their profits. So their margins are in decline, and they need to, they're almost forced to undergo these outsourcing contracts in order for them to stay competitive and stay relevant in the market. And then in emerging markets, they have similar cost pressures. That outsourcing is a very lucrative way for them to get that OpEx down very quickly and offload some of their risk in operations. And then, so the business model transformation, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the professional services chart. But so basically what you have going on here is you have LTE peaking in 2014, 2015 timeframe. And then in the later years of the forecast, the growth is really going to come from ongoing outsourcing and this business model transformation we're talking about, where operators are putting in, they're onloading new applications, and they're looking to fully leverage the LTE networks that they've just deployed. Next slide, please. Okay, so professional services. Let's do a deep dive here. There's a lot going on in this market. So what I've done is broken out the total spend on professional services by 8 different categories. So in the early years of the forecast, the growth is going to track deployment, broadband deployments. So if you look at the orange color there, network infrastructure integration, that's the biggest spend area, one of the biggest spend areas in the early years of the forecast. And that growth in that area is going to be directly correlated with LTE deployment and the fixed access deployments we were talking about. Operator consolidation, SDN and NFV are also going to drive professional services, particularly consulting and systems integration. That's more on the, that's going to drive a variety of buckets here. So consultancy, planning, design, optimization. It's also going to drive network infrastructure integration and the OSS integration. OSS, BSS, modernization and transformation. So as operators start to bring on these new billing plans, so looking to leverage their data plans, their data offerings here. So things like shared data, M2M, these other areas that are leveraging their data network, they need to make investments in the OSS, BSS to bill for those new services and to manage the network elements to enable those services. So there's going to be ongoing growth in spend on the OSS, BSS, and that's going to be a very strong growth area going forward. Also, security and applications integration are going to be the fastest growing spend areas. When we look at all of the TIS services in aggregate over the next 5 years, the fastest growing areas are security and applications integration. For security, it's really about securing the network, providing good, if operators are coming out with mobile wallet and these cloud offerings, the customers aren't going to buy these things if they're not secure. So there's going to be ongoing growth in spend in those areas. For the applications integration, it is onloading these new applications to enable these new business models. So the M2M, the cloud, these offerings are going to require application onloading, and then so that's going to be a growing area of spend in the later years of the forecast once that infrastructure is laid out. Next slide, please. Okay, so from a geographic perspective now. So this is our global view, and we've disaggregated it across the 3 main regions. So 2014 peak spend, that's going to be led by a trail off in spend in North America. North America is going to peak this year in LTE deployment. We've got all of the Tier 1 operators in North America are they're more than halfway done with their builds if you look at pop coverage. T-Mobile's catching up, but now that they have Metro PCS, they're a little bit closer to that goal. So that is going to be, so in Americas, that's going to give way to Latin America, which is ramping up end of this year and through 2014. So that's going to be the main driver in Americas in 2014 as North America starts to trail off. In other regions, in EMEA, we're forecasting a bottoming out in Europe in 2013, so this year. and we are expecting European operators especially to ramp up LTE deployment in the next 5 years. But EMEA operators are going to stretch out that investment. So let's take a step back for a second. If we look at who's deployed LTE so far, you've got Japan, South Korea, and the United States and Canada. And then there's the rest of the world. So if we look at those 4 countries specifically, there was an accelerated deployment of LTE. The bulk of that deployment took place in the last 2 years. So in Europe and the rest of EMEA, it's going to be more of a gradual deployment with each of those subregions deploying at a different rate. So we'll get into that in the next slide, please. Okay. So disaggregating that further, if we look at Americas specifically, you'll notice that North America peaked this year, and Latin America is going to peak in 2014. LTE and operator consolidation is going to drive that growth, particularly for professional services. Operator consolidation, we're seeing a lot of that in North America right now, US with T-Mobile and Metro PCS tying up, and then Sprint and Clearwire are the next wild card, whether they go to SoftBank or Dish. Regardless of who Sprint and Clearwire go to, it's going to create opportunities to grow TIS revenue for the vendor population. In CALA, operators are being incentivized by governments to rapidly deploy LTE. We've seen governments be very forthcoming in deploying spectrum and encouraging operators with subsidies and other incentives to cover a certain amount of their population in certain countries within a certain time frame to foster the economic development of their country. And we're at the very early stages of this for LTE. In many cases, operators in CALA are still deploying 3G. So either they're going straight to HSPA, or they are overlaying HSPA Plus over their existing HSPA infrastructure. So disaggregating EMEA further, again, Europe, there's going to be a bottoming out this year, and then it's going to be gradual growth through the rest of the forecast. Operators in Europe are going to stretch out the rollout of LTE. There's been some early pioneers there. Telefonica, Telenor, some of the Nordic operators have been very early in their LTE deployments. We're waiting for some other of the big guys to really start deploying on a national basis, which will really move the needle in the total market. In Middle East and Africa, Middle Eastern operators in general tend to be early adopters of new technologies. We've seen Mobility and certain other operators in the Middle East push forward with LTE deployments, but so far they've been primarily in urban areas. We have not really seen the rural coverage come out yet. And then in other Middle Eastern countries, they're going through ongoing civil and political unrest, and that has stifled LTE deployment in those countries. So that investment is going to come over the next few years rather than at an accelerated pace over the next 2 years. Looking at Africa, they're lagging. They are probably lagging the most of all the regions. In many cases, African operators are still deploying 3G, and 4G is still on their radar, especially for some of the larger operators in South Africa and some of the other developed countries in Africa. But the vast majority of Africa is still focused on 3G rollout. So LTE is going to really be in the later years of this forecast. 2016 and 17 is when it's really going to start to ramp up. One more thing I'd like to touch on in EMEA, in Europe specifically, OSS/BSS overhaul. Right now what's going on in Europe is RAN modernization. So what operators are doing is ripping and replacing their legacy RAN with multi-mode RAN. And that is, so basically what they're doing is consolidating their 2G, 3G base stations, putting in one base station in its place that's optimized for 2G, 3G, and 4G service. And by doing that, they're enabling a quick migration to LTE when they decided to go out with commercial service. That's going to give way to OSS/BSS spend. There's a lot of legacy systems in Europe that need to be either ripped and replaced or optimized to deal with data, to bill for data, and new billing models that are coming out with data. So that's going to be another spend area. But again, that's going to be a gradual process. It's not going to be at the accelerated rate that we saw in North America, Japan, and South Korea. Okay, and last but not least, Asia-Pac. Let's disaggregate that a little bit. These three subregions we've broken out here are moving at different speeds. So we've got LTE builds were largely completed in South Korea and Japan in 2012. So in both of those countries, LTE coverage is almost 100%. That is giving way to capacity enhancement now. But if you look at an aggregate level, when you go from coverage to capacity, the overall spend, the volume of spend starts to trail off. And that's what we're already seeing in South Korea and Japan. We saw that also with vendor results in 1Q13 from this current round of earnings. Some of the major NEPs saw a decrease in revenue from Japan and South Korea, and that's why. There's this shift taking place now from coverage to capacity, and the spend level starting to decline. With that said, China is the big driver here. You'll notice that Northeast Asia, which we include Japan, South Korea, and China in that, China is the growth engine there. China Mobile this year is kicking off LTE deployment in the country. They're planning to spend $6.9 billion on just their LTE deployment this year. Massive contract. It is larger than AT&T and Verizon's. If you look at how much the actual money they're putting out for this year on just LTE. And we're seeing all the vendors jockeying for position here. They've already gotten preliminary market shares within that contract. But China Mobile, they need to cover 1.3 billion people in China, and that's going to take them, the next 2 years at least to cover that many people. China Mobile is targeting 200,000 base stations to get those up to TD-LTE by the end of this year, and then another 150,000 base stations in 2014 to finish up the rest of that deployment. So they've been the visionary here in China. China Telecom and China Unicom are going to be following in China Mobile's footsteps. All said, we're seeing peak spend taking place in 2014 in China. Rest of Asia, it's really India is the big driver there. So India and Australia. India in particular, they are still going through regulatory issues with license revocations for spectrum, and operators are stalling in going forward with new investments in their infrastructure because there's uncertainty around policy, and there's also uncertainty about M&A. The Indian market's ripe for M&A. There's 18 large telecom operators in that country, and there is, some of the operators are waiting to see what happens, how the market shakes out, and what the competitor landscape is going to look like before they decide how they're going to architect their networks going forward. So with that said, India is really going to be, we're looking at 2015 when they're really going to start spending on LTE. Right now they're trying to get as much, monetize the 3G networks as best they can before they can justify going into the LTE. And then Australia, last but not least, they're another needle mover here. Fixed access is a big deal in Australia. The NBN, or National Broadband network that the government's trying to deploy there, they want to roll out fixed access to all of Australia. That is going to be a big driver over the next few years. Also LTE, deploying LTE across Australia, that's another big initiative. And that's another spend driver for 2014 in particular. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've looked at each of the service areas in depth and the drivers there, and then we disaggregated each of the major regions and subregions and looked at all of the drivers. Now we're going to look at the vendors, the vendor landscape, and look at what was the market share in 2012. and what do we see going forward in this market. Generally speaking, the TIS market is highly fragmented. You'll notice that Ericsson, Nokia, Siemens, and Huawei, the top 3 vendors by revenue, control a third of the market. With that said, there's going to be ongoing mergers and acquisitions here. We've seen Oracle step in with their purchase of Acme Packet and Telecom. We've also seen NEC enter the BSS area with the purchase of Convergys's IM unit. We are seeing other vendors also positioning, entering new markets. There's this big push into IT now. There's an ongoing push into cloud, network function virtualization, all of these hot topics that the industry is talking about right now. Certain vendors are getting a head start here and positioning early. And so what does this all mean? Software firms are going to be the primary acquisition targets. So TIS suppliers that do services around software or have a heavy software business, they're going to be the biggest targets for some of the more equipment, hardware-focused vendors who are looking to get into these and stake a claim in some of these new areas and ride these opportunities over the next over the forecast period. So the conclusions here: TIS spend is going to be correlating closely with LTE deployments and, to a lesser extent, the fixed broadband deployments. But in the later years of the forecast, the spend on deployment services and maintenance services, so the product attached services, is going to trail off, and that's a cyclical trend here, because you have the LTE. Once the LTE infrastructure is in place, then the spend really shifts towards monetizing that infrastructure and finding cost efficiencies from operating that infrastructure. So that's where the professional services and managed services picks up the slack, and those two areas are really going to be growing through the entire forecast period. So, yep, outsourcing, popular OpEx reduction tool. We're going to see more and more operators really taking a hard look at their operations and looking for either outsourcing, outtasking small slices of their network. So maybe the OSS specifically, or their BSS, or maybe they'll go with the whole network and just outsource the entire network to get the maximum benefit from that outsourcing can provide. And then the business model transformation we were talking about, that is really going to drive professional services in the mid and late years of the forecast. So that is where a lot of this growth is going to come from. And also, mind you, that's where a lot of the good margin's coming from as well. It's the professional services, some of those types of services are very lucrative, and they get very good profit margins. So before we open it up for Q&A, I just want to highlight here our research agenda at TBR. Every quarter, my team and I get together and we go through, we look at the entire market here on a global basis, and we identify what are the main topics in the industry. So these are the primary four that we've identified: network function virtualization, LTE deployment, enterprise solutions, and consolidation. We're looking very closely at each of these areas in particular, and we are writing about these areas in our vendor reports, which we put out quarterly. So really looking at how vendors are performing in these areas, what their strategies are they getting any traction with customers? We're looking at all of these things from many different angles, and this information that we get is rolling up into the benchmark, and we're able to see trends and drivers here, and who's outperforming, who's underperforming, and all that information gets boiled up into our benchmarks from our vendor reports. So with that, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great. We've had a couple of questions come through, Chris. The first question we had was actually in regards to slide 11. The question was, what makes you confident that EMEA will recover? Just back to slide 11.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, Middle East and Africa have already started to recover. If you look at some of the leading vendors, you'll notice that their revenues have started to actually grow. In MEA, in Europe, the declines in revenue that we've seen are starting to moderate. And in some cases, there are some pockets of growth there. Generally speaking, the reason we see Europe bottoming in 2013, the operators are, so let's go back to the modernizations we were talking about before. Over the last 2 years, most of the leading operators in Europe have been overhauling their legacy RAN, and they have been putting in multi-mode RAN. So their networks are now ready to quickly migrate to LTE with little additional investment in some cases. So we're going to see, once they get enough spectrum to enable that overlay of LTE, we're going to see them come out to commercial service very quickly. For certain operators. For other operators, especially in the periphery countries where they're really struggling with unemployment and some of these other economic issues and political issues, there's going to be more of a delay there as operators are really just focusing on the day-to-day operations and getting through every quarter by quarter instead of taking where do we see ourselves in 5 years and mapping their assets in that direction.
The next question we had is, you talked a lot about LTE deployments, but what about fixed broadband deployments? How do you see TIS spend on fixed infrastructure looking to the forecast period?
Yeah, so fixed broadband, so I already touched upon Australia a little bit. There's other countries around the world that are pursuing national broadband deployments. So China's another big example, Broadband China initiative. This is something the government is doing as part of their central planning. Over the next few years, the Chinese government wants several hundred million households in China to have fixed broadband access, so rolled out to the premise. That's a big spend driver, but it's going to be more gradual. With fixed, it's tricky because you have to actually physically deploy fiber lines, and there can be right-of-way issues. There's regulatory issues in the municipalities. There are taxes that need to be paid to run lines through, certain through buildings, et cetera. So it's going to take a little bit longer for operators, to actually deploy those access lines. Whereas for LTE, you put up a cell tower and you can cover a 20-mile square radius with LTE coverage. So it just takes a little longer for them to deploy those access lines. And also the government doesn't work as fast as everybody would like. So, it takes time for them to to finalize what their agenda is and to, provide these subsidies to the operators to get them to actually start deploying that infrastructure.
Okay. Our next question is in regards to the professional services slide. I'll see if I can find that. The question is, didn't professional services revenue decline in 2012? Why would it increase this year? Do you have evidence of this? What about price pressure? Not sure what slide that is.
Yeah, so professional services, there was a little bit of weakness in 2012 for certain companies, namely some of the traditional CNSI suppliers. So Accenture, IBM, and HP especially really struggled in professional services last year. However, we did see some of the traditional network equipment providers actually had a very good year in professional services. And that is primarily around the systems integration of getting the RAN modernizations that were taking place. Also, the LTE deployments require a range of professional services, all the way from the systems integration to the consulting, planning, design, optimization of the network. So there were certain pockets of growth in the professional services market. On an aggregate level, we are expecting that market to rise in 2013, so this year, and that's really driven by operators getting in the preparation stage for getting the LTE networks out. So the consulting, planning, design, optimization is critical. And then once they start putting the infrastructure in the field, that's going to throw off a lot of systems integration work.
Okay, the next question we had come through. If outsourcing is going to boost, I think the training market will shrink as a lot of operational people will move to the vendors, so it will be training costs in the future and less training revenue. What is your view on that?
Yeah, so training, there will be some outsourcing of that. Keep in mind that if you look at the market size, the sheer size of OpEx that could be outsourced, even if you take that into account that some of that will be outsourced, the training, on an aggregate level, it is going to grow. And what are the drivers there? So you're putting out you're putting out new network elements, you're putting out new business models. The network is becoming more complex. There is going to be a greater need for that training. And yes, the vendors will provide some of that as part of the outsourcing, but if you look at some operators like take an AT&T or Verizon, for instance, the vast majority of their OpEx is still internalized. It has not been outsourced. And operators like that are still going to require that investment in training for those functions in the network.
Okay, the next question we had come through. Do you not see much opportunity in M2M or cloud services for telcos?
So we see huge opportunity. We just did a project last week on, we were doing North American operators and looking at their CapEx and OpEx spend, and we noticed something that was very striking to us was the sheer volume in spend in cloud last year. So data center and so it's mostly data center spend that's taking place, and it's primarily the wireline operators. So companies like CenturyLink, Bell Canada, AT&T, Verizon, these companies are really ramping up investment in cloud on both a CapEx and OpEx layer. And we're at the very early stages of seeing these cloud offerings really getting traction in the market, but these operators are staking claims here and really investing in building out those data centers to provision those services. So yes, we do see that being a very big opportunity. And then for M2M, that has taken a little while to really ramp up. As chipset prices come down and there's more innovation taking place, we are expecting there to be more adoption of these M2M solutions. And once the LTE is deployed and there's some traffic taken off of the 2G and 3G network, operators are going to have extra capacity from which to send those signals through their network for the M2M. But through the forecast period, definitely M2M is a critical growth area.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. We have another couple questions come through. If anyone else has any additional questions, please send them through now. The next question is, can you elaborate on how operator consolidation will cause an increase in TIS spend? Does an operator M&A typically cause the addressable market size to shrink?
Yeah, so in some cases, the pie will shrink. If you look at services, though, some interesting things happen. Let's take a few examples here. Metro PCS and T-Mobile. Is that going to be net accretive, or is the size of the pie going to shrink? Well, it depends. If you look at professional services, their spend is going to have to increase, because what's going to happen is there's a transition period going to take place here. So Metro PCS is going to refarm their CDMA spectrum, and they're going to migrate that up to LTE, and they're going to do the circuit switch fallback on T-Mobile's GSM network. This transition, this refarming of the spectrum, this convergence of the two disparate networks is going to require a considerable amount of systems integration work Also, if you look at the back office, you know, they want to get the synergies out of this pairing. So this is going to throw off considerable amount of spend on OSS/BSS integration to get the cost efficiencies from running on, you know, several platforms instead of many platforms. There's other areas as well where there's going to be spend on extra spend or pull forward of spend on TIS from these tie-ups. One other thing I'll point out is for Sprint and Clearwire. So Sprint's going to eventually buy Clearwire. I think that's pretty well known. Whoever buys Sprint, Sprint's going to take that money and then buy Clearwire. That's basically what's going to happen. So when Sprint gets Clearwire and Sprint has extra money, Sprint's going to put that money to use, and they're going to leverage the vast spectrum holdings that Clearwire has in the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum layer. So that's going to, you know, really enable, it's going to throw off a considerable amount of TIS spend because you're going to need to deploy new cell sites, or you're going to need to integrate new baseband units in the existing cell sites that Sprint's using to work on the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum band. There's going to be some consolidation of back office systems. There's going to be a decommissioning of the WiMAX network and an overlay of TD-LTE over the network. So if you look at what's going on and what the operators actually have to do to realize these synergies, it's going to throw off a tremendous amount of TIS spend.
Okay, looks like we have time for one more question. You mentioned application integration will be the fastest growing TIS spend area through 2017. Can you provide some additional color on the drivers of that growth?
Applications integration?
Application integration, yeah.
Okay, so applications integration, it's really about, so let's take a step back here. So operators trying to not become the dumb pipes. So how do they stay smart? How do they you know, keep the OTT providers at bay, and how do they monetize their network assets? So in order to do that, they need to bring a proposition, a differentiation to the market where their services are you know, able to compete against these OTT players, and also capitalize on some of these nascent growth areas like mobile wallet, some of these other areas. So in order to enable these offerings, the operators need to onload special applications into their infrastructure to provision for these services. And that's going to require a considerable amount of spend on applications integration. So it's really about how do I take my data network now that I have LTE, and how do I monetize that? Because it's not just about one subscriber, one plan now. It's about, you know, one subscriber, many different devices that one subscriber is using. And then, oh, by the way, there's enterprise, who is also going to require more and more communication. They're going to need more and more communication solutions for their own operations. So you have, if you take the net of that, there's going to need to be strong spend on the application layer for the operators to enable these offerings that they can then provide to the end users.
Great. We're at the end of our time. So I want to thank you, Chris, for taking the time for this presentation, and thanks everyone for sending in those questions. If you are interested in accessing this report, you can reach out to any one of the email addresses listed on the slide. As promised, here are all the social media links. We encourage you to follow both Chris as well as TBR on Twitter, and to check out our SlideShare and YouTube pages. On the way out of the webinar, we are running a short 3-question survey to figure out your thoughts on the quality of presenter, quality of the content, and any other open-ended questions or comments that you may have for us. We are using this feedback to improve our presentations quarter to quarter, so we appreciate any feedback you guys do provide. I'm going to leave the chat function open for another 5 minutes or so, just to give anybody last minute some time for us to ask questions or to have follow-up conversations with Chris. And if we do not hear from you, look forward to speaking to you guys all again on some of our webinars coming up in the future. Have a great afternoon, everyone.